Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it. Today we are in Acts chapter 14, and something that I think might guide a little bit of conversation today is a question that would be, what would you do if you were on a missionary trip and all of a sudden people started worshiping you like God? You would probably have some really awkward conversations and a lot of clearing up to do. Well, that is definitely what happens with Paul and with Barnabas today as we are reading about some of their missions work as they are moving into Iconium and as well as Lystra. There's actually quite a few things that happen along this journey that are very significant, I would say.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think one thing that's sticking out to me as we read through Acts, there is a little bit of a method that Paul and Barnabas seem to follow. You can see in the beginning of chapter 14, if you look, it's literally verse 1. They entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. It seems like when they come to a new city, they go first to the synagogue to preach in the synagogue. We've even seen stories where they sat and they waited to be called on, and then they stand and preach. This is where Paul preached his first sermon that we talked about the other day. They go into the synagogues first, I think, because they would have some common understanding, and it would be a way of reaching people in the city who at least have a similar background, a similar understanding of the movement of God. And then after they preach in the synagogue or try to reach people in the synagogue, then they move to the greater populace. And they'll follow that pattern for some time.
That's really interesting. I didn't catch up when we were reading, but as you're talking about it, I try to think of my own experience in even short-term missions where you go and even we've been on some trips to Mexico even, and going to the churches locally, it's almost like a weird edifying moment where we can come and kind of just give our own testimonies. And a lot of times there were more meaningful things that came out of us going into churches and just even just sharing our own lives with the Christians that were there, and then followed up by after even our training times and whatever, working with the churches, then we would go out to the streets and do our ministry there. So it is interesting that pattern is not necessarily something super foreign to us.
Yeah, the strongest missions kind of things we've done, outreach kind of things we've done, has always been when we're partnered with established local churches. And that doesn't mean they're huge churches. Sometimes they're pretty small churches, but whenever we have established partnerships with a church that's already there and we help them with something they're already doing, and whenever we return to that same place over and over and over again, so that you actually have strong relationships. And unfortunately, there's a lot of silly short-term missions trips initiatives out there. A lot of them don't do those kinds of things. A lot of
over
them
and over,
try to
stuff.
cut their own path or just do something on their own. And a lot of times you try to cycle in and out of different places. So it's kind of extra credit that. There's not necessarily a clearly stated missions philosophy here in Acts 14. But it is worth noting that Paul oftentimes heads to the synagogue first and then works out from there. And that's what he does here. And actually, when he preaches in the synagogue here, some people do come to believe in what he's preaching. They come to believe in Jesus. And then they heal this man. Paul heals this man that had been crippled from birth, and then he starts to get a lot of people's attention. So you can see in verse 8, now at Lystra, so they're moving from Iconium to Lystra. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And that's when this whole they worship them as gods situation.
Which was kind of my question at the beginning. So you're on this trip, you're doing your thing, and all of a sudden the praise is going really strange places. It's not ultimately going to God. It's going to these men who they think are these other gods that aren't real. And it could be really awkward really fast, because obviously that is not the intention of what Paul is up to. Also, on top of that, what's really encouraging to me is the fact that the reason that this happened was, again, because of the faith of the man. So the people that are like, the man is not in a bad headspace. Paul is not in a bad headspace. It's just what is being perceived by the people around. Like, whoa, who's this guy? What's he up to? He must be one of the gods. So it would, I don't know, such a like sweet, cool moment turned to like really awkward really quick.
If you read this chapter and you're kind of thrown off by how the worship gets this far, like there's a huge crowd, the priests show up, they want to actually sacrifice animals. If you're wondering why it took Paul and Barnabas so long to be like, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. They're not speaking the same language. That's kind of like a small detail that you can miss, but it's actually listed there where it says they're speaking out in like Iconian or Canonian. It's verse 11. So there is some discussion here that's beyond the language barrier, and it takes them a second to figure out like, wait, no, this is not right. And that's how it gets that far. But it is worth noting that Paul and Barnabas are like, no, do not worship us. We are just normal old guys.
Well, something interesting too, our study Bible kind of speaks to the fact that Lycaonian language was used. And Paul and Barnabas, it says that they may not have even been aware of what was said.
Right.
And they may not have even been aware of like the situation until the priest got there and started offering these sacrifices or wanted to offer these sacrifices. And that was when they were like, whoa, what in the world? And like, it's so funny too. Like even thinking of Spanish speaking instances on some of our trips where not like these things were happening, but you have those moments where it's like, or at least to this extent, you have those moments where you think you're having this whatever conversation. And it's like, oh, we are like totally missing each other right now. And it seems like that could be a similar situation of what's happening with some of the people in the crowd.
So it is worth pointing out that in Acts 12, we saw Herod take the throne and put on his royal robes and make a big show. And the people started to worship Herod as though he was a god. And Herod accepted the worship, and God judged him on the spot for doing such a crazy thing.
These guys start ripping their clothes off and just saying, like, in anguish, like, don't worship us.
Yes.
It's not us. It's like, we brought this word to you so that the living God might be active in your life, not these other ones.
Yeah, and it seems intentional because this is Acts 14. That story about Herod was Acts 12, so, like, it hasn't been much time in the narrative that Luke, who's writing this, is telling us, like, Herod accepted worship and it was wicked and it was evil. When Barnabas and Paul were offered worship, they rejected it outright, saying, hey, no, like, you need to worship the one true living God. Don't be distracted by all these fake gods that are a waste of your time. Our study Bible also points out that it seems like history supports the idea that in this region there was some kind of prophecy or something about the fact that Hermes and Zeus would return to the area. What's interesting about that is that whatever legend or prophecy or whatever actually sets these people up to hear the gospel.
Yeah.
And it's sort of interesting how like this regional legend actually set up the message that Paul and Barnabas had, because I guarantee you people who grew up hearing about Hermes and Zeus coming to speak to them like saw this happening and were willing to at least listen to what they had to say.
Whether or not they accepted it.
And people came to Christ because of it. So it's pretty interesting how those things go together.
Well, and not even all of them, which is kind of a bummer too, because in verse 18 it says that even with the words that they gave, like basically saying, don't worship us, it made very little effect on them, and the people still were trying to offer sacrifices to them. So although kind of a bummer, it was still happening regardless of what they said. And then in the next portion, the Jews are still like actively, like I should say this, the Jews that do not believe are still actively like hunting down Paul and Barnabas. Like, no way, don't you dare start like running around here, running your mouth about Jesus and all these things that you think are so important that are not in their eyes. And then they actually like, they stone Paul and drag him out. I'm wondering like, why not Barnabas too? Is it just because they knew of Paul's standing? Like they knew that he used to be some higher level Pharisee and now he's not? I don't know. But they drag him out to the point where people actually think that he is dead, which is nuts.
I mean, it seems like they were still sort of together, but the crowd was able to get a hold of Paul first.
Yeah.
And then Paul, I guess, playing dead, kind of, is able to regather up with Barnabas, and then they move on to another city. And this is a pattern we're going to see, too, where there is great persecution against what they're teaching, and they take it and they move on and they preach and they take it again. You do start to get this idea throughout Acts that it's similar groups of people that are moving, like almost following Paul's journeys and stirring up new crowds of people to be angry about what's going on. But all of this in Acts 14 is kind of a precursor to Acts 15, because a lot of people who are not Jewish in background and in custom and in nature are coming to follow Jesus. And that is creating problems because the church has to figure out a way to include Jewish believers and non-Jewish believers. They have to figure out a way to bring unity to this group of people, and they have to define what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And that's going to happen in Acts chapter 15. I think Acts chapter 15 is a really, really powerful chapter in our journey. So you're definitely going to want to stick around and hear that tomorrow, or you could just read ahead on your own. That's not against the rules. You could read that today. But definitely check out Acts 15, because some of the persecution that's been happening in these last couple of chapters is leading to this point where they need to sort some things out and clarify some things.
Cool little note, too. After this little journey, they, at a certain point, return to Antioch, which is, in our study Bible, mentions that their time that they are there could have been, doesn't mean that it is, could have been the time where Paul was writing his letter to the Galatian church, which is actually really interesting if you think about the timeline of all of it, because it seems like these events could be like very, like one spin-off kind of thing that just one from the next, but these are all kind of happening within the same time frame. It's kind of cool.
Galatians is really interesting because Galatians has a lot to say about if we're justified by the law or not, and what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and how much you have to follow in law and custom.
That's what they're confronted by all the time.
Right. So he's addressing these things as he's moving from place to place and teaching these things. So it is interesting when you do a chronological reading, which we did last year. You see like kind of what's happening in Acts, and then what Paul's writing about, what John's writing about, what Peter's writing about. So it is interesting to see those things in chronological context, because they're not just speaking into a void. They're speaking to real issues that they're experiencing, and they're trying to teach people well how to conduct themselves.
So I don't know, this chapter is interesting. Coming away from it, your part, I'm not sure. How do we pull a your part out of this?
Don't let people worship you. That's not a good idea.
Seems like pretty straightforward, but I mean, my mind definitely goes to like missions work that we have done in the past. But maybe it's more or less just like that whole idea of the church edification.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was a valuable conversation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for me, where my mind goes, and this is not a fair one-to-one comparison, so like don't jump on this if you're frustrated by it. I think pride to some degree and arrogance to some degree
How are you finding that?
Is welcoming worship of yourself.
Ah, okay.
Like any time that you think, and I'm not saying like A equals B. Like what's happening to Paul and Barnabas is not just pride and arrogance.
Well, that actually caused me to think earlier when you were saying that, like about the whole being careful of those things.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot, honestly, of like my frustration with like, well, why don't we see these kinds of signs anymore? And why don't we see this kind of stuff as often as what the Bible would say? But I wonder how much too God is like, you're not ready for this. Well, you're not ready for this.
There's many regions in the world where there is a lot of this happening. Yeah. And it's important to recognize that because it's not that it doesn't happen. It actually does happen, and it happens often, but just not in these areas very much. I just think I am drawn to pride and arrogance. I think because that sometimes is my own downfall. And I think that is in some degree like worship of yourself, thinking higher of yourself than you should be, assuming that you were able to get things because of you and not because of God. So I would just caution you against those things. Yeah. If you're looking for like a really firm, tangible takeaway from Acts 14, my creative takeaway is just be careful. Don't think highly. Don't think too highly of yourself. Don't think that you were able to create the things that were given to you by God. Be thankful for them and worship God because of them. We'll be back again tomorrow with Acts 15. Looking forward to it. We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
Acts chapter 14. Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia and the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they lifted their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel in that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Persia, they went down to Attila, and from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.